I'm Kirk Evans, Principal Premier Field Engineer with Microsoft. In this section, we'll look at developing SharePoint 2013 workflows with SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer 2013 now provides a visual workflow designer. In the previous version, SharePoint Designer 2010 offered integration with Visio 2010 so that you could design workflows visually in Visio and then import them into SharePoint Designer. Now you can visually design your workflows by dragging, dropping, and connecting shapes directly within SharePoint Designer 2013. You can set all the properties of workflow action in the new Visual Workflow Designer. Just select the shape and then click the action tag. Also, if you click Properties on the action tag, the property grids for conditions and actions appear in the Visual Designer just as they do in the Declarative Workflow Designer. So let's take a look at the change here. Is that in this we can see that we have a visual designer. As long as we have Visio installed on the local machine, then we can switch between representations of the workflow. And this is not the same as in SharePoint 2010 where we had to import the workflow into Visio. Instead, we were able to actually interact with this model. We can drag the shapes around, we can change the workflow, we can change properties. So here you can see that in the log to history list action that we can even configure the message by using the visual model. So this is a big win for folks that are using SharePoint Designer. You still have the existing text-based designer, and it has a number of improvements as well, so including the ability to cut, copy, and paste. But the new designer in SharePoint Designer, when Visio is installed, allows you to not only customize the workflow actions and stages, but you can also modify the properties of the actions directly in the Visual Designer. So let's take a look at how we can use SharePoint Designer 2013 to build a SharePoint 2013 style workflow. Start by opening SharePoint Designer 2013, and we'll open a site. For our demonstration, we're going to create a workflow that will be associated with an announcements list, allowing the end user to manually kick off a workflow for a specific item. So we'll start by creating that list, and it will be called announcements, and it'll be based on the announcements list type. Choose OK. That created a new list called announcements. The next step in our requirements is that we also need to create a workflow that is associated to that list. So we'll go to the workflows navigation node, and there are three different types of workflows you could choose from. There's a list-based workflow that associates to a specific list, such as our new announcements list. A reusable workflow that allows you to associate the workflow not to a specific list, but rather through a content type. And then finally, a site workflow where the workflow is not associated with a list or content type, but rather through the site itself. We'll associate this to the announcements list that we just created a moment ago, and we'll call this My First Workflow. Next, we'll choose the platform type. Platform type shows here as the default SharePoint 2013 workflow, and that's because I've installed and configured the Workflow Manager as part of my SharePoint form. If you haven't installed Workflow Manager, then you won't see this option. You'll only see the option for SharePoint 2010 workflows. We'll use SharePoint 2013 workflows so that we can take advantage of the new capabilities in this new style of workflow. One of the new capabilities is immediately evident. It's called a stage. A stage allows us to group a set of actions together and then to transition between stages. We'll go into more depth in that in a subsequent demo, but for now, we'll just work with one specific stage, and we'll provide a name for it called My First Workflow Stage. The next thing we'll need to do inside the stage is we'll provide an action, and we can choose from a number of different actions. We can go to the ribbon and use the action button to see a complete list of actions that are appropriate for this stage. We have actions for calling an HTTP web service, pausing for a duration, sending an email, updating a list item. There's a number of different actions that are available to us. We'll start with log to history list. Log to history list has a parameter called message. We'll need to provide the value for that. We have a couple different ways to do that. One is that we can simply type a value like hello world here. That's not as interesting as maybe using the builder property. And the builder allows us to type whatever we want in here, such as the current item's title is. And the benefit of using the builder is that we can also add additional lookup values. So we can add or change lookup and look inside various data sources, such as inside the current item, within the associated history or task list. We can also look within other lists, such as customers or site assets. So we'll start out with just the current item itself. And the field that we want to look up is the title. And we want to return the field as a string. Choose OK. And that allows us to now insert the item's title as part of this message. The next step we'll want to do is set a field in the current item. Now, instead of going through the action and trying to find the set a field action in here, what we can do is simply start typing set. And we can see that a search is performed against the actions, and we're asked to press enter to view. And then there are 4 different results that were found: set field in current item, set time portion of date time field, set a workflow status, or variable. So we want the set field in the current item. The field that we want to set, notice that we have parameters for this action. The field that we want to set will be the body field, and the value will be updated by workflow. The next thing we'll want to do is to transition to a stage. We want to make sure that the workflow has an end state. So we can simply use the go to a stage activity, and we're prompted for the stage that we need to transition to. We can either transition back to the current stage, creating a never-ending loop, or we can transition to the end of the workflow, which will then terminate the workflow and complete it. We'll transition to end of workflow and finally choose save. Another interesting new capability of SharePoint Designer 2013 is the ability to switch views between a textual view and a graphical view. If you have Visio installed on the same machine that you're using with SharePoint Designer, then you'll be able to switch between these views simply by going to the Views button in the ribbon and choosing Visual Designer. A visual representation of the workflow is then generated that shows the start, the eventual termination, and shows the activities that are available between them, as well as the stages that contain the actions. Further is that in SharePoint Designer 2010, there was a capability to design a SharePoint workflow, export it as a VWDI file, then import it into SharePoint Designer, and to finally provide the final implementation. With this visual graphical interface, what we're able to do is to be able to actually edit the properties directly within the graphical view. So we can go to the properties of this action and see that property was called message, and we see that the current value is the current item's title is with the builder. If we click, we even get access to the builder itself, and we can make modifications. Same thing with set field and current item. If we go to properties, we can see the property for the body and the field value. And since we coded that value in the value property directly, when we go to value, we can see that has, in fact, the value that we provided updated by workflow. So we have the ability to switch between the text and graphical view. We also have the ability to set additional properties on the workflow. If we go backwards through the breadcrumb navigation, we'll be able to see that there's additional settings, such as what is the task list that any tasks that are created as part of this workflow will be written to, or the workflow history list that's associated with the workflow. We can also provide start options. Do we want the workflow to automatically start when an item is created or changed, or only have the workflow available to be manually started? And that's currently the default option. We can also open the associated list for a list-based workflow, set other properties such as the description, and we can also see what is the associated list and the platform type. Now that we've we set the workflow up, we set the properties of it, now let's save the entire workflow. We'll want to go back to edit workflow. Another handy feature is the ability to check for errors to make sure that the workflow does not have any errors before we attempt to publish it. And then finally we'll choose publish. that publishes the workflow and its association to SharePoint. Now if I go back to the SharePoint site and I refresh, I should see the new announcements list that's been created. I open the new announcements list and I'll create a new announcement. I'll say my first attempt at workflows and choose save. Now that we have an item, remember that the workflow option that we set for the start option was to have it manually started. We can do that by opening the menu, going to workflows, and we see that our my first workflow is shown up here. So we'll start it, and in just a moment we'll see after we refresh that the name of the workflow is used, the name of the current stage is used to show the workflow's status. We open that up and we can see that our log to history list did in fact log that this is my first attempt at workflows. We can see at what time and what was the user ID that kicked off the workflow. And we can see the status of the workflow, that it's currently completed. And then finally we can go to the item itself. So we click the link to navigate back to the item, and we can see that the body of the workflow was in fact updated, and it says updated by workflow, and the modified by field shows last modified at that specific time by workflow on behalf of administrator. So we see that the workflow, that we capture that the information was updated by a workflow on behalf of a specific user. Another very handy part of being able to find why was a list item modified. So in this section you learned a little bit about workflows. We introduced the concept of the SharePoint 2013 style workflows and demonstrated the capability of switching between a text and graphical view, making changes to the workflow, and then finally publishing and then seeing the results of the workflow. Microsoft introduced the concept of stages to workflows in SharePoint 2013. So stages, founded on the flowchart workflow type in Workflow 4.0, mitigate a lot of the challenges people had creating workflows with SharePoint Designer in previous versions of SharePoint, specifically the inability to loop within workflows. Each stage has an entry point and a gate. All workflows start by entering the first stage, and at the end of a stage, the workflow author indicates the next stage, optionally using a conditional if statement, and the workflow should proceed to that next stage. Further, each workflow stage can contain multiple steps and actions within it. So let's kind of take a look at what a stage looks like in SharePoint Designer. So let's take a look at how stages kind of work inside SharePoint Designer. This slide shows how you might create a workflow using stages. So starting from the top left, where the workflow starts, the workflow is initiated and enters stage A. It executes one or more actions and then enters a gating function. The gating function can be a condition that checks for the presence of a value such as A, B, or C, and then redirects to another stage. So in this example, if the value is A, it redirects to the start of stage A. And that's what provides that looping capability that we mentioned previously. If the value is B, then it's redirected to stage B, and if the value is C, it's redirected to stage C. Both stages B and C have the same capability to use conditional logic and redirect to another stage, whether that is another stage further down the workflow chain, or it's back to itself, or even back to the beginning of the workflow, back to stage A. So inside the stages, the activities can do a bunch of work, and then they can pause and be persisted while waiting for something else to occur, and then finally there's another gate at the end. Now typically there is a stage at the very end that ends the workflow. Again, the concept is that we move between stages, and then finally you'll have typically an end stage that ends the workflow. SharePoint 2013 workflows are built using a series of actions that are arranged in stages and steps, as well as conditions and loops. And there are a couple of different types of actions that we'll want to look at. The first is a core action, which is an action for adding comments or adding time to a date, or calling a service, or performing a calculation, sending emails, stuff like that. And a list action would be something like to check in or check out items, copy items, update items, and these perform an action on a SharePoint list. We can check things in and out, we can copy items, update them, those kind of things. Conditional actions are things like if statements. So we can check it to see if something was created or modified by a specific person, or if it contains a value, or whatever other condition that we might have inside of our workflow. And then we have utility actions, and these provide string manipulation functions, such as checking to see if a field contains a value, or starts with a string, or allows us to even concatenate strings together. And then finally, as with workflows in SharePoint 2010, you interact with tasks, and tasks are used to manage the interaction of the workflow. So we can assign tasks or start a task process, and this might include creating, updating, or marking a task complete, or even waiting for a task to complete before moving on within the workflow. Let's take a look at how we can use this concept of stages in SharePoint 2013 inside of SharePoint Designer to create a somewhat complex workflow that provides not only looping but also conditional gating logic to be able to move between stages. So let's open up SharePoint Designer and open up our site. There's a list called announcements. It's sitting right here. If I go to preview in browser, you can see that there's currently 2 items in it. We'll create a new workflow that will be associated to that announcements list. We'll call it My First Staged Workflow. The platform type will be SharePoint 2013 workflow instead of the older SharePoint 2010 workflow. By choosing SharePoint 2013 workflow, that enables us to take advantage of stages. We'll start by creating our first stage called workflow initializing. We'll introduce another stage and another stage. The middle stage will be called waiting for updates, and then finally I'll have the last stage to be request complete. For each one of these stages, then we can transition between the stages. Let's go to the transition to a stage, and we'll have the action simply go to a stage, and the stage that we'll choose will be waiting for updates. Now, whenever we go from waiting for updates, we may want to have additional logic to determine additional stages that we go to. And when we're in the last stage of our workflow, we may want to simply transition to the end of the workflow. So let's go into the action and say go to a stage, and this last action will simply go to end of workflow to signal that the workflow is now complete. But this waiting for updates, what we'd like to do is something more complex than just transition from one stage to another. Let's put some conditional logic in there. To do the conditional logic, we'll need 2 more stages. Let's call them stage A, stage B. Stage A, and this one will be stage B. And what we'd like to do is inside this waiting for updates, we'd like to introduce a condition to say if any value equals value. And if the value that we're looking at is the current item's body, and we want to say contains ignoring case, and the value will be, let's say, choice A. So if the value that it is entered is choice A, then we want to go to a stage, and the stage we want to go to will be stage A. Otherwise, we'll simply return back to go to a stage, and the stage will be waiting for updates. So if you enter anything but stage A here, then we're just simply going to go back and wait for more updates. If you do enter stage A, though, we'll then go to, or enter choice A, then we'll go to this stage A section. For each one of these, we'd like to see in the history list what's going on. So let's add in an action log to history list. And the message that we'll add here will be workflow initializing. It'd be nice if we didn't have to simply go in and add the item for each one of these, or add that action. So another nice thing about SharePoint Designer 2013 is the ability to copy paste. For each one of these, then we just change the value, waiting for updates. This one will be stage A, this one will be stage B, and then finally request complete. As we transition, what we'd like to do is when we get to stage A and we log something to the history list, what we'll need to do is find a way to actually wait for updates in each one of these stages, the waiting for updates, stage A and stage B. So let's enter that, let's add in a wait And when we type wait, we simply hit enter, and we can choose between two different types of events. One event is wait for the field change in the current item, or wait for an event in the list item. And we'll wait for an event in the list item. And the event that we'll look for is when an item is changed in the current list. And then when that is changed, then we'll simply do another log to history list. This time what we'll log will be slightly different. We'll actually log the body of the current item. We'll do that by simply going in and logging the current item's body as string, and we'll say OK. And we'll want to again replicate this same behavior copies, so we'll just go to stage A and we'll add that same behavior to stage A. So for each one of these, we'll wait for a change, and then after the change we'll log what the current body of it is, and then we'll check the value of the body and decide how to transition. Now in stage A, I want to do the same transition to stage logic here. So we'll copy that and we'll paste. This time I want something slightly different for the else condition. So if the current item's body contains, let's say instead choice B, then I want to go to stage B. Otherwise, I'd like to add some more conditional logic here. We'll add another if value equals value, and the value that we'll look for again will be if the current item's body as string contains, ignoring case, choice B. Actually no, we'll say if it contains end. If it contains end, then we'd like to go to a stage, and the stage will be request complete. Otherwise, we want to transition back to the waiting for update stage. So we'll go in and say another action is go to a stage, and the stage will be waiting for updates. So you can have nested conditional logic inside a condition. So we're checking to see if the current item's body contains choice B. If so, go to B. If it contains end, go to end. Otherwise, go back to waiting for updates. So we have all of this logic that we have in this transition to stage. What we'd like to do is also just copy that and put that inside the stage B logic. We'd also like to grab the wait for item change logic here. So we'll put that in stage B as well. We'll wait for an item to be changed, and then we'll log the current body to the workflow history list. We'll determine if the current item body contains choice A, and if it does, then we'd like to transition to stage A. Otherwise, if it contains end, we'll go to end. Otherwise, we'll go back to waiting for updates. Finally, when we get to request complete, we'll simply log the request as complete and go to end of workflow. We're doing a couple of different conditions and transitions between the various stages. Let's go back and check the graphical view. If we have Visio installed, we can see a graphical view of the workflow to determine if it looks like the logic applies. As the logic is generated, we can see that we start out in the workflow initializing stage, we log the history list, then we go to waiting for updates. We check to see if a value equals value, and we could even use the properties here to determine if it contains ignoring case, and we can check the various properties of it to see what's the operator and if the value contains choice A. So if it contains choice A, yes, then we transition to stage A. Otherwise, we transition back to waiting for updates. If it does contain stage A, then we go into this logic and we'll be able to check to see the condition. We can see what was the operator, and the operator is if it contains choice B. And if it does, then we transition to stage B. Otherwise, we check to see again what was the value. We'll see the operator, and if it contains end, if it does, then we'll transition to end. Otherwise, we transition back to, we'll see that highlight all the way back to waiting for updates. Another thing you might want to do while checking the transitions, we go back to the text designer, we can also check for errors to make sure the workflow does not contain any errors. And then finally, we'll just simply choose publish. So we choose publish, that publishes the workflow and creates the association to the announcements table. So now I should be able to go to the list and libraries, go to the announcements table and choose preview in browser. I'll be able to go to one of my list items, go to the workflow option, and start my first staged workflow, the workflow that we just created a moment ago. If I refresh, you can see now that the status becomes waiting for updates. If we go back to the workflow for just a moment, and we go to my first staged workflow, and we look at the properties, we can see one of the properties here is automatically update the workflow status to the current stage name. So the stage name will actually reflect to the end user what the status of the workflow is. So if we go back to the website, we'll be able to see that we're currently in the stage name waiting for updates. If we click this link, we can go to the workflow status page. The workflow status page shows us the workflow history list, where we see that we're currently in the state waiting for updates. We also have a link to the item. Go to the item and we edit, and we call this choice A, save, and in just a moment we refresh. We see now that we transition to stage A. If we look at the history list, we can see workflow is initializing. We were waiting for updates, then we detected that it contains choice A, and we transitioned to stage A. Go back and we'll edit the item one more time. This time we'll call it choice B, and choose save. The workflow status is updated to reflect the current stage name, stage B. And then finally, we'll edit the item one last time, and we'll enter end. Choose save, refresh, and now we can see that it shows the status is request complete. If we click that link to see the workflow status page, the internal status is completed, and the last stage name that was completed was named request complete. We can see in the workflow history list that in fact all of the stages were transitioned as we expected. So this was an example of using stages in SharePoint Designer 2013.
In this section, you were introduced to SharePoint 2013 workflows. We kind of talked about the difference of SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013 workflows. We also focused on the improvements specifically with stages, and we saw how stages have the ability to move between different stages, and that provides us the ability to use this flowchart type concept from Workflow 4.0 to be able to do looping, as well as how each stage has a gate that allows us to transition to another stage. And then finally, at the end of a workflow, we typically have a stage that ends the workflow. So you can see that the capabilities of Workflow 4.0 with SharePoint 2013 provides a really, really cool solution for workflow developers.